Hello, and welcome to Lead, Learn, Connect, where we explore the worlds of training and coaching. I'm your host, Alan Krieger, and on our show, we explore not just the how of helping others grow, but behind-the-scenes work of building a successful business, overcoming challenges, and staying connected to what's really important. My guest today is Phil Brown, a trainer, podcast host, and author with expertise in experiential education. Phil will share the keys to using structured experiences to teach more effectively. Phil is originally from the UK, as you'll hear. He's now living in Vermont and a trainer with High Five Adventure Learning Center. And he was a guest on a very interesting podcast. Whether you're a new trainer, a seasoned facilitator, or just curious about what it takes to thrive in this space, this episode is for you. Let's get started. Welcome, Phil.
Hey, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about your unusual podcast experience.
Yeah, a few months ago, I had the pleasure of joining Conan O'Brien of late night US and late night fame on his podcast. Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, and was invited on there to do some team development for their team in their studio. So I came on Zoom and ran an activity with them, and it was as chaotic as you would imagine it could be. I would say, like, people who are used to working with human beings in any kind of experience, like sometimes you get people who take more air than others, and or have more energy, and that was certainly the case. I would say it was like I wouldn't have been able to achieve the task when I first started in this industry, but I felt more prepared for it now. And people asked me, like, how did you manage their energy? I said, I think it's more about experience and dealing with people like that on a regular basis. It's certainly not a unique experience. And I actually felt more comfortable facilitating the activity portion than I even did about the questions about myself. So I think it went well. I encourage people to check it out because I do think it's a good showcase of facilitating high energy participants. I think in training models, sometimes you don't get the full experience when you're teaching others of like what happens when. And that was a good example of what happens when.
Yep, that certainly was. I got to see it, and I have a lot of respect for you for handling that. Was quite a high energy, and he had something he was asking you to do, but then he did a lot of talking about a lot of other things. So,
yes,
but you handled it very well. Yeah, you kept your presence, and you got through the activity. So, and he gave you a good answer. It was a team building. Ended up being
exactly. Yeah. I sometimes think like the role of that facilitator. Someone used this phrase to me once, and I can't remember who, but I like it. It's, instead of being the sage on the stage, you're the guide on the side. Mm-hmm. And I really like that phrase. And I think that you just don't know where the outcome's going to go. You just give enough guidance and hope it turns out. And I think that was a good example of like, you just give enough. You set the scene, if you were, like for them, and then they kind of fill in the gaps. And it actually, yeah, as you said, I remember even in the moment as he was speaking in my head thinking like, oh, it's working. You sometimes you have to remind yourself that what you're able to do. And it's like, oh, actually, this is working with them as well. Yep. But everyone's, it's humans are humans. So it doesn't matter who they are. But yeah, it was a good realization of like, if you set up the scene well, if you frame an activity okay, like, it will go where it goes, and then you can be quiet, and they will fill the gaps. It's kind of nice.
Yeah. So on that sage on the stage, guide on the side, one of the questions I have about, especially adventure-based, you do all kinds of experiential, but some of the adventure, mm-hmm. They're up on the ropes and doing wild activities, and some people just enjoy having fun, and it ends up being a lot of chaos. How do you make sure there's learning out of that? Because that's one of the challenges, I think, is that somebody can take something home that they didn't start with. And again, thinking more, you work in a lot of different contexts, but let's say more in the leadership and team building in the work world.
Yeah, and I want to kind of to set the scene, set the stage on this one, adventure education. I kind of put under that umbrella of experiential education, where you're creating an experience by which you can learn, and it just happens to be the adventure portion is often a higher stretch experience for people. We consider it as any part of the tool in the toolkit. So your tool might be a deck of playing cards that you use something with, or it might be a ropes course. It's what you have available to you. The thing I think is really important, though, and this leads to a story, and I'm going to be a little vulnerable in this and share a story of where it didn't go well. When I first started in working for High Five, I, as an individual, had experienced adventure programming and had some really positive outcomes for myself, either in terms of my own development and feeling like I was able to empower myself more and advocate for myself more, and I had that in the medium of those experiences. And I think when I first started, I had a little of naivety about, if I just put them in this experience, it will speak for itself. Like, people will have a learning experience and I won't have to do much. I just bring them to a space and that will solve the problem. And I'm saying it's naive because I think there needs to be real intentionality whenever you do anything you do. And especially if you're doing stuff that can seem chaotic and can draw the visual, and it can be like overwhelming for people to come into a space. But I had a group. I was doing a team development program for an intact corporate group, and I didn't plan. I didn't. I thought like, well, they're coming to us. They'll have an experience. I'll just be able to ask some questions, and they will have a great time, right? Like I wasn't intentional about how I was setting up the activities. I thought if I bring them to this and I teach them how to belay, they will be able to find that thread, that connective tissue, and they will result in having this eye-opening experience. The evaluations that I had at the end of the day were not very positive. So to the extent where I had a letter that was handwritten by the executive director of that organization to our executive director that got shown to me in a moment of feedback,
Oops.
which was quite disarming as a 25-year-old, that said a big long letter listing many of my failings. But one of the lines that stood out to me was that Phil has baseline facilitation skill. And I still remember that today. It's been 12 years, but it's like I have that kind of. I still remember that line, and I think it's important that it wasn't the greatest method of me learning that. Maybe you shouldn't have necessarily been shown. And hey, read this letter. This is not great, but because I did take it personally, of course. But I think the intentionality that I'd missed is I didn't frame the activity. I didn't plan for the goals, using the goals of the group to craft the experience. And since then, I think my ability to, it doesn't matter what the activity is. I can take an activity and I can use that same activity with 10 different groups in 10 different ways. And it just comes down to the overall framing. So the way that I ultimately are able to get the educative tissue, how do I make people feel like it's a learning opportunity, either for them as an intact group, maybe they're learning something technical, whatever. It's about taking an activity and framing it. So starting, if you consider a frame goes all the way around the outside of a picture. If I start off by saying that we're going to use this activity with the intention of talking about this subject, that also gives me an opportunity to use that as a reflection tool as well. So if I say, and I'm going to use a very generic example, but if we're going to focus on communication, I'm going to do this activity and I want to really highlight the way that we talk to each other. And that might be in a supportive language, it might be in a critical context, but I want us to really focus on how we are talking to each other when we do this next activity. I do the activity and then I can say at the end, so if you remember at the start, I talked about us in communicating. So let's reflect on that. How do we think we did that? Were there examples of where we, and I'm able to immediately draw that, and they're not taken unaware because I sort of set them up a little bit to say, This is where it's going. I will acknowledge it often sometimes goes in a way that I didn't plan for. So I think it's a poor idea to consider that the frame has to be rigid. Because if I don't listen, I don't pay attention to the group in the moment, then I can actually misinterpret some situations and say, let's talk about communication. They were like, well, we were fine. Well, I didn't pay attention to those. So I think it's great to have that framing, be able to read and adapt and be flexible. And that's another skill set I think that most of us who work in the team development world have, that flexibility. And it comes from experience. But if I go back to that moment where I had baseline facilitation skills, it's because I was very clear about what the outcome was going to be. without even starting the experience. And so I could never hope to get them where they needed to be because I just assumed I had way too much assumption made. No planning, no flexibility, the effective ability to focus and change. And now I would say I'm beyond the baseline, I'd hope, but like as that intentionality is built in, so I can take an activity and make it more educative.
So something previous guests have talked about is that the delivery is more important than the content. Obviously, you need both. But one of the concerns I have I've been through some experiences with people at the baseline level,
Yeah.
and we had an experience and we talked about it. It was kind of fun, but we didn't leave with much information other than the emotional experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how much I'm a content person. When I present in more detail. I give
Mm-hmm.
people a framework and I fill it in rather
Yeah.
than just a framework. So like the team styles that I shared with you,
Mm-hmm.
that when we talk about how do you communicate, I give people 4 different ways that people might communicate, help them kind of look at which was theirs, which was somebody else, how did the clash occur, did it occur, what did it mean? So how much content do you work in, or is it 90% processing the experience? Do you have a teaching part of that? How do you
Yeah.
balance that?
Well, a large part of my work is actually, as much as I do a good chunk of team development, a lot of it is teaching others to be able to lead adventure programming for the benefits of team and leadership development. So there are a lot of models that we utilize. I would say one that I can highlight here in a short way would be something called the ABCDs of problem solving. So, like if I was going to lead an activity that had a problem solving component, and I wanted to teach someone a structure by which they can solve a problem, I would utilize this. The A is analysis. So analyzing the problem, because I think that too often we interact with problems and different people don't actually know what the problem is we're
Yep.
solving. So people are solving all different manner of problems. So analyzing what is the problem at hand. The B is brainstorming or ultimately coming up with ideas, and that can fluctuate between different people in terms of how that can be helpful. Some
Mhm.
people that idea isn't great, and so being able to come up with a numerous different ideas, and there are models to be able to support that idea as well. Then C is choose, so choosing one of the options that we've brainstormed. I think that another failing that I find groups run into is they come up with tons of ideas, and then they do something that they didn't even discuss, or you'll see people like, well, who choose? How did we come to that decision? Like you're doing this one thing, and this group here is siloed off, splintered off, and then the D is actually doing it, and I think that, and then the E is evaluation, and how this kind of flows for us is we also use this thing called the experiential learning cycle, who some of your listeners may be familiar with. The concept, really, in a basic way, is that we have an experience. We analyze the experience, we reflect on that, and then we have an opportunity to do it again. We go in this cycle of reflection and repeat. Um, and I think that and brings up another thing I think is a critical to the experiential models is repetition of structures and skills. Like I wouldn't just show the ABCD of problem solving and never come back to it. So I would often keep coming back to these models and having us practice. It's a skill like any other that we need to repeat and practice and refine until it becomes a little bit more autonomous for the learner. So that's a model that I often will use in problem solving moments. Um, Another one that I think is actually really important when I consider groups, and we talk about in our world, there was a guy called Chad Littlefield who uses this phrase called connection before content, and it comes into that same way that like delivery is more important and the connective tissue between you and your participants. But we have something in adventure called the challenge zones. um, People are often very familiar with the idea of stepping out of comfort zones, and it gets used very often, that language. But challenge zones, the concept is that you've got the comfort zone in the middle. If you think about it like a bullseye image, in the center there's comfort. On the sides, the next barrier is challenge, stretch, growth. often where our learning happens, and then you have panic zone on the outside. And panic zone, the learning outcome there is often, hell no, I never want to do that again. That's normally the learning outcome. But everywhere in that middle is where we kind of have a spectrum. The closer you are to comfort, the less likely less you're going to learn. But the easier it is, the closer to the panic, the more you might learn, but the harder it is. And but what I think has been really important as we consider a lot of these models that people teach, and I put this out to everyone listening, is to challenge the models in some way, just to start looking at things a little bit more critically. And something I've been really focusing on recently is, especially when I consider adventure, is that in order for people to have actually really positive learning experiences, or to be able to pay attention to what is being given when we think of skill acquisition, is they need to be comfortable. If people are close to panic, they are not listening. Their executive function is completely out of the window. So they are fight, flight, freeze. That's their mindset. So what we actually need to do before we ever get into adventure programming is to build comfort. We need to build the comfort zone before we ask people to step out of it, because they're very likely already out of it when they arrive at a program. And I think about that not only on the adventure course, I think that about in corporate team building, in their office spaces. If you're coming to a meeting and you're asking people to speak up, well, you need to be able to have created an environment where people feel safe to do so. And so you can't expect other people. So a large part of what we do in adventure programming is actually we spend a good chunk of our time building comfort zones. And it like, we'll go out to a course and people will think like, well, we haven't climbed for however long. And it's like intentional. There are plenty of times where I brought a group out to our course and the course is just a distraction. And I'd prefer to not see it because the group is definitely not ready. And I think the mistake gets made is where we push people too far, too quickly, and we ask them to stretch too quick, and then they dip into that panic. And then what is the learning that we've had? So someone used this phrase as well, which I really liked, is experiential learning is not learning from the experience, but crafting an experience that maximizes learning. And it kind of is a slight reframe. So it allows us to really consider, how are we creating the best space, the best environment for learning? And how can we maximize the experience for those people who are coming in, all members of those people?
Yeah, that was
The last thing I'll reference, sorry, Alan, and this aligns with a book, but The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. If people haven't read that, I do encourage it. She's really talking about social gatherings as like weddings and things like that. But for the work that we do in collecting human beings together, it's a very powerful read because it really focuses on the gathering experience, less so about the content that we're teaching, which you need them both to be in balance.
Yeah, that was a really good description of why we use icebreakers
Yeah.
at a deeper level. Because I learned that you want to start a class with an icebreaker, you want to warm people up. But what you said is you're moving them into their comfort zone. They're in a strange place, and they need a little something. An icebreaker in the beginning of a meeting, again, to kind of break the ice. I like it. It's actually building a safe space. That was really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to go back to something you said earlier, your ABCDE and the experiential learning cycle. Traditional training, we present the model ABCDE, and then we have them do some kind of an activity where they work on a problem together, and then we debrief it. You had, I think, experience and then reflection. Where does the presentation of ABCDE come in when you're doing that?
Yeah, so for me, I would typically, if I know I'm going to be leading a problem-solving activity, I will, in the initial framing, I would say, I'm going to lead you through an activity now that is going to ask us to solve a problem. But before we get there, I'm going to give you a framework that you could utilize to help in that process. And then I'll list out the ABCDEs, and I'll have it either written up somewhere so they have access to it. What I also then use is, once they've done the activity, I actually don't reflect on the experience of the activity. I reflect on the experience of the model. And so what I will do is I'll take laminated pieces of paper, and one has an A on it, one has a B, C, D, E, and I will lay them out on the ground or around the space. And I ask people to go and stand next to the letter representing the step that they believe that they had the most success at as a group. So which one do you believe that you've had the most intentionality, we focused the most on, And it's an individual choice. So you might get scatterings of people standing in different locations. They then reflect upon that, and I ask them to say why they're standing at that location. The next question would be, which of those did you feel like we didn't do the best at? Did we not attend to in the best way? And then they'll stand at those. And I ask people just to think about those that moment and acknowledge that. And as we move forward and we create more problems for you to solve, consider that area that we need to lean on more, or that we spend too much airtime on. And that creates the aim is really to try to create some balance between those, because I think too often people do analysis paralysis, and they start too much on the A and the B, and they haven't actually been intentional about the last three. They're not choosing, doing, and evaluating.
Right.
And for some people, that can be a really good thing. They like to be very analytical. They like to be focused on how do we solve it. And for others in the group, you can see their attention is gone. They want to just do the activity. Can we just do it? And I think that it brings up a really good point that there are some activities that I will create or I set up where the only way to get something right is to actually get it wrong. And the reason I want to do that is because I think that gets us into the experience model quicker than spending too much time on the planning phase. Because I think a lot of the analysis that happens with groups is they're doing that because of a fear of failing. And in our models of adventure, risk is inherent. And so we're trying to get people much more comfortable with making mistakes and taking risk, and rather than being overprotective of failing. And so there's some intentionality that I want people to start focusing. And typically when I do that reflection of laying them on the ground, typically the A and the B are something that they feel like they handled really well. C, D, E, and those are the ones they're not doing as well. That's very typical. And I would say there are always moments where I get atypical experiences, but that, I think it sets me up well to then be able to lead into some follow-up. And I think if you don't do that, then once again, you're showing a model that they never use, or showing a model that they haven't had an opportunity to actually critically understand.
Okay. Yeah, that was I've learned some good things. I appreciate that. That was helpful.
Yeah.
And can you give an example of like an aha moment where someone really had a profound learning that you remember, something that really stood out for you?
Yeah, I would say I had a group where, and you sometimes get this where you're working with groups where there are certain individuals that do take more air, and it might be hierarchical. And I had a really, and I think this was really positive. I had a very like stretching experience for people that like pushed people into areas of discomfort. But in doing so, whenever you get to that, I think that there's some nervous energy for, I think, newer facilitators to push people in an area that they are really uncomfortable with handling. So like if it becomes conflict related, like they don't know how to deal with that moment. And I lean on those. I think those things are really positive. When I see things not going so well, a part of me internally is cheering, because I know that I have some more meat on the bone to talk about. And to add a little bit more context to the group, it was I was working with a police department, and I think, people can make assumptions about what that might look like, but it was very alpha based individuals. And so when you have a lot of people who want to step forward into a leadership role, but there's too many leaders and there's too much talk, and then you get to those periods of conflict. There was one member of staff of that group who was very adamant in their decision making. They knew that what they were saying was correct. Now I knew that it was incorrect. To give context to the activity, it was called Not or Not. So N-O-N-O-T and then K-N-O-T. Essentially what I'm doing is it's an activity that's designed around consensus building. And I will lay down on the ground a tangle of rope that I have laid in either a knot. So when they pull the ends, it will either form a knot in the middle, or when they pull the ends, it's just a straight line. And they aren't allowed to touch it, but everyone can look at it. And as a group, they have to decide whether when the ends are pulled, is it going to form a knot or not? And they're not allowed to pull it until there's 100% agreement in their decision. So if you've got 12 people and they've all got very strong opinions, that activity, which can seem very simple in its concept, can last 45 minutes to an hour because I have to give them opportunities to figure out how to create consensus. And so everyone was in agreement except for this one person. So we've got to almost a full agreement, but they're not ready to move forward because this one person is adamant of the decision. Now, I know in that moment that what they're adamant on is not correct because I know what I've tied or I've placed on the ground. So I just have to let this be. But he was setting himself up for an embarrassing reveal. And I could have tried to alleviate that tension by making that not apparent for him. But because he was so determined, it felt appropriate to just let him have that very much aha moment of being wrong. And so when it ended up getting pulled, I was very intrigued about how he would respond. To his credit, he was able to have this good realization of and because what I was tying it into is, have you ever experienced a moment in your work experiences where that same experience has happened, where you've been so determined about what you and then found to be wrong? How do you deal with being wrong, especially in front of your peers? And he was very it was very positive. It led to a good moment of clarity for him. Because it was ultimately we'd created a space where it was safe enough for him to feel embarrassed in front of that group. So there's a lot of setting up. I think sometimes you can create testing experiences for individuals and you haven't set them up enough for that, and then that can domino effect in the negative for you. But it was a really good moment for him to realize that in that moment. And a lot of other people were like, oh, I'm glad that happens because that happens a lot and we've never felt able to talk to him about that. And so it was one of those things you just fall into. I didn't intend for that activity to create that experience. But when the groups have that and you can just prod a little bit into that, I find that is a very powerful experience because it's less about me. I've teed him up in a way that I hadn't intended, but they had that experience for themselves.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great story and a great example. So we're just about out of time, but I just want to give you a minute if you want to talk about your book, Tinker, and then we'll
Yeah.
wrap it up.
Yeah. So myself and some colleagues had this. A lot of people, when we go to conferences or present, asking for activities. And so it's give us something new, give us something new. And we had this realization that for most of us, we do the same activities. And as I sort of said, if you can get really good at framing an activity, you can change the parameters of it to meet any group you work with. And so that's where Tinker really comes from. It's a book that takes 25 classic activities that you may use in team development and talks about the way that we change the parameters of it to meet any group. So the front matter is talking about our adaptation and variation process. The middle of the book is activities on one side, the very basic outline, and then the variations are on the opposite side of the page. And then the back content of the book is questions that our clients have asked us around this concept of tinkering with activities. And so I think the end goal for me with a book like that is, rather than buying activity books and filling up your repertoire of hundreds of activities, because there are a lot out there, I would prefer intermediary or advanced facilitators to get really good at 10, 15, 20 activities and know that they could use them with any group, because it's less about you, it's more about them. And so how do we create an activity that can best match them? And you will build your confidence up as a facilitator and a trainer. And so then you'll be able to continually add to that. So 2 years, 2 activities every year. I have this running activity thing with my colleague where I add a new activity in my repertoire every year, and I spend that year adapting it. And either it works, and there's plenty of flops that exist out there, but you will end up figuring out what works for you. And I think the Tinker model of skill acquisition is a much better way than just learning new activities every single, just buy a new book and know 20 more. I don't think that's the method of growth in the industry. I think it has to come through repetition, and repeating activities is the way you can do that. So we give you some ideas around that.
Great. How to tinker with some good strategies. So we'll put a link
Mm-hmm.
in the description to that if people want to find out more about the book. But that's
Awesome.
it for today's episode of Lead, Learn, and Connect. A huge thank you to Phil Brown for sharing some great insights into experiential education and education in general. If you found this helpful, be sure to subscribe, share it with a colleague, and leave a review. You can find out more about Phil's work and additional resources in the show notes. And if you're ready to deepen your communication or learn more about my work in the team model of communication, head over to our website or follow us on LinkedIn or other social media. Until next time, keep leading with intention, keep learning, and keep connecting. Thanks for listening.